Then he finds Ghini and Skakabarosi opposite the church, and when he asks where Squarciafici is, they weep and tell him that Squarciafici took a Genoese dart in the throat in the last attack, and Bottolino also weeps, for he has never liked war and now less than ever, and he fears for his old father. Here is Bottolino in the beautiful main square, bright in the pale March sunshine. He sees children carrying big baskets of stones to reinforce the defenses, and skins of water for the sentries, and he is proud of the indomitable spirit that has gripped the citizens. Here is Bottolino wondering who all these people are crowding into Alessandria as if for a wedding feast, and his friends tell him that this is their great misfortune, that fear of the imperial army has brought here people fleeing all the surrounding villages, and, yes, the city has many hands, but also too many mouths to feed. Here is Bottolino admiring the new cathedral, which may not be big but is well made, and he says, "Why, it even has a tympanum with a dwarf on the throne," and around him they say, "Oh yes," as if to say you see what we're able to do, but that isn't a dwarf, stupid, it's our Lord, maybe not well done, but if Frederick had come a month later he would have found the whole last judgment with the oldsters of the apocalypse. Here is Bottolino asking for a glass of the good stuff, and they all look at him as if he came from the camp of the Imperials, because it's clear that wine, bad or good, is not to be found, not even a drop. It's the first thing they give to the wounded to keep their spirits up, and to the families of the dead to keep their mind off their troubles. And here is Bottolino seeing around him wan faces and asking how long they can hold out, and they make superstitious gestures, raising their eyes as if to say these things are in the hands of the Lord. And finally here is Bottolino meeting Anselmo Medico, who commands 500 foot soldiers from Piacenza, who have rushed to help the Civitas Nova, and Bottolino is pleased at this fine show of solidarity, and his friends Guisco, Trotti, Boiti, and Oberto del Foro say that this Anselmo is a man who knows how to fight, but the Piacenza men are the only ones. The League urged us to rebel but now they don't give a damn about us. The Italian communes are a fraud. If we come out of this siege alive, from now on we owe nothing to anyone, they can deal with the emperor on their own, and amen.
But how is it that the Genoese are against you, when they helped you build the city, and gave you gold? The Genoese know how to run their business, you can count on that, so now they're with the emperor because it's in their interest. Everybody knows, and they know, that, once it's here, the city won't go away, not even if they knock it down, like Lodi or Milan. So they wait for the afterwards, and afterwards what remains of the city is still useful to them to control the trade routes, and maybe they'll pay to rebuild what they helped destroy, but meanwhile money keeps changing hands, and the Genoese are always there. Bottolino, Ghini said to him, you've just arrived and you didn't see the attacks in October and the ones in the last weeks.
They're fighters, not just the Genoese crossbowmen, but those Bohemians with the mustaches almost white, who if they manage to set a ladder in place it's a real job knocking it down.
It's true that, in my opinion, more of their men died than ours because, even if they have the rams and the cats, they've taken plenty of clods on the head. Anyway, it's hard, and we tighten our belts. We've received a message, Trotti said, that the League's troops are on the move, and they want to surprise the Emperor from behind. Do you know anything about that? We've heard the same thing, and that's why Frederick wants to make you surrender first. You aren't thinking of giving up now, are you?
What an idea.
Our head is harder than our cock. And so, for some weeks, after every skirmish, Bottolino went home, to tally the dead more than for any other reason. Panizza, too? Yes, Panizza, too, and he was a good man. And then he returned to tell Frederick that those men surrender? Not a chance. Frederick no longer cursed, but confined himself to saying, what can I do about it?
It was clear that by now he repented having got himself into this mess. His army was falling apart, the peasants were hiding the grain and their stock in the woods or, worse, in the swamps. He couldn't press forward to north or east, or he would encounter some vanguard of the League. In short, it wasn't that these rustics were better than the people of Crema, but bad luck is bad luck.
However, he couldn't just go away, because he would be humiliated forever.
As for saving face, Bottolino realized, from something the emperor said one day, referring to his boyhood feat, the time he had persuaded the Terdona people to surrender, that if Frederick could only exploit a sign from heaven, any sign, allowing him to announce Urbi et Orbi that heaven itself was suggesting they go back home, Frederick would seize the opportunity. One day, while Bottolino was talking with the besieged, Galeotto said to him, "You're so intelligent and you've studied the books where everything is written. Don't you have some idea that will make everybody leave, now that we've had to slaughter our cows, except for one, and your mother is going to die of suffocation, penned up in the city like this?"
And then Bottolino had a fine idea, and he immediately asked if they had actually invented that false tunnel Trotti had talked about a few years before, the tunnel the enemy was to believe led straight into the city, but really led the invader into a trap. Of course, Trotti said, come and see. Look.
The tunnel opens over there. In that thicket 200 feet from the walls, just below a kind of boundary stone that looks like it's been there for 1,000 years, but really we brought it from Villa del Foro.
And anyone who enters there ends up here, beneath that grating, from which you can see the tavern and nothing else. And as one comes out, you do him in? The fact is that, generally, with a tunnel that narrow, it would take days for all the besiegers to come through, so they send only one squad of men, who are supposed to reach the gates and open them.
Now, apart from the fact that we don't know how to inform the enemy that there's a tunnel, after you've killed maybe 20 or, at most, 30 poor bastards, was it worth the effort to do all that work?
It's nothing but a cheap trick. If it's only to hit them on the head.
But listen to the scene I can almost see with these eyes of mine. The moment the men come in, a blast of trumpets sounds and, in the light of 10 torches, from that corner appears a man with a long white beard and a white cloak, on a white horse with a great white cross in his hand, and he shouts, "Citizens, citizens, wake up, the enemy is here."
Before the invaders have made up their mind to move a step, our people appear at the windows and on the rooftops.
And after the enemies are captured, our people sink to their knees and cry that the man in white is St. Peter, who is protecting the city, and they push the Imperials back into the tunnel, saying, "Thank God that we're sparing your lives. Go to the camp of your Barbarossa and tell them that the new city of Pope Alexander is protected by St. Peter in person."
And will Barbarossa believe a tale like that? No, because he's not stupid, but since he's not stupid, he will pretend to believe it because he's more anxious to end this than you people are. Let's suppose you're right. Who'll arrange to have the tunnel discovered? Me. And where are you going to find the asshole who falls for it? I've already found him, and he's such an asshole that he'll fall right into the trap on his shitty face, as he deserves, but anyway we agree that nobody gets killed. Buandulino had in mind that Fob Count Dieppold, and to spur Dieppold into action it was enough to make him believe he was harming Buandulino. So all they had to do was let Dieppold find out that there was a tunnel and that Buandulino didn't want it discovered. How? Nothing easier, since Dieppold had his spies following Buandulino.
After nightfall, returning to the camp, Buandulino first passed through a little clearing, then entered the wood, but once he was among the trees, he stopped and looked back just in time to see, in the moonlight, an agile shadow slipping, almost on all fours, through the open space.
It was the man Dieppold had put on his heels. Buandulino waited among the trees until the spy was about to fall on him, pointed his sword at the man's chest and, while the other was stammering in fear, he said to him in Flemish, "I recognize you. You're one of the Brabantines. What were you doing outside the camp? Speak." "I'm one of the Emperor's ministerials." The man said something about a woman and sounded almost convincing. "All right," Buandulino said. "In any case it's lucky you're here. I need someone to guard my back while I do something." For the other man this was a blessing. Not only had he not been discovered, but he could continue his spying arm in arm with its object. Buandulino reached the thicket Trotti had mentioned. He didn't have to pretend, because he really did have to scratch around to find the stone, while he grumbled as if to himself about receiving word from one of his informers. He found the stone, which did look as if it had grown there with the bushes. He worked over it, scraping foliage away until he had uncovered a grating. He asked the Brabantine to help him lift it. There were 3 steps. "Now listen," he said to the Brabantine. "Go down these steps and move forward until you reach the end of the tunnel, where you may see some lights. Take a good look at what you see and don't forget any of it.
Then come back and report."
I'll stay here on guard." To the soldier it seemed natural, however painful, that a gentleman should first ask him to stand guard and then should stand guard himself, while sending him into the unknown. Buandulino had brandished his sword, surely to cover his back, but with lords there was never any telling. The spy made the sign of the cross and set out. When he returned after about 20 minutes, gasping, he reported what Buandulino already knew, that at the end of the passage there was another grating, not very hard to lift, and beyond it was a solitary little square, and so this tunnel led right into the heart of the city. Buandulino asked, "Were there some turns, or did you go straight forward?" "Straight," the man replied. And Buandulino, as if talking to himself, said, "So the exit is a few dozen meters from the gates." That traitor was right. Then, to the Brabantine, "You realize what we've discovered.
The first time there's an attack on the walls, a squad of brave men can enter the city, fight their way to the gates and open them. We just have to have more troops outside, ready to enter."
My fortune is made. But you must tell no one what you have seen tonight, because I don't want anyone taking advantage of my discovery. With a munificent air he handed him a coin, and the price of silence was so ridiculous that, if not out of loyalty to Diepold, at least for revenge, the spy would immediately run and tell him everything. It requires little imagination to picture what was to happen. Thinking that Buandulino wanted to keep the news secret, so as not to harm his besieged friends, Diepold hurried to tell the emperor that his beloved son had discovered an entrance into the city but was taking care not to reveal it.
The emperor raised his eyes to heaven as if to say, "The dear boy, him too." Then he said to Diepold, "Very well, I offer you the glory. Towards sunset I'll deploy for you a good attack force just outside the gate. I'll have some onagers and some rams placed near the thicket.
When you slip into the tunnel with your men it will be almost dark and nobody will notice you. You enter the city, open the gates from inside, and overnight you become a hero." The Bishop of Speyer immediately claimed the command of the forces outside the gate, because Diepold, he said, was like his own son. Imagine. And so, on the afternoon of Good Friday, when Trotty saw the Imperials waiting outside the gate, as always when darkness was falling, he understood it was a display to distract the besieged, and behind it there was the hand of Buandulino. So, discussing it with Guasco, Boidi, and Oberto del Foro, he took care to provide a credible St. Peter. One of the original consuls, Rodolfo Nebbia, volunteered, and had the suitable physique. They wasted only a half-hour debating whether the apparition should hold the cross or the usual keys, deciding on the cross, which would be more visible in the gloaming. Buandulino was a short distance from the gates, certain that there would be no battle, because someone would first emerge from the tunnel bearing the news of the celestial assistance. And, in fact, in the time of 3 Paters, Aves, and Glorias, from inside the walls a great stir was heard, a voice that to all seemed superhuman shouted, to arms, my faithful Alessandrians," and a chorus of terrestrial voices cried, "It's St. Peter." Oh, miracle! Miracle! But right at this point something went wrong. As they would later explain to Buandulino, Diepold and his men had been promptly caught and everyone tried to convince them that St. Peter had appeared. They would probably have fallen for it, the lot of them, except Diepold, who knew very well from whom the revelation of the tunnel had come, and, stupid, but not that stupid, he realized that the idea had been conceived by Buandulino.
He freed himself from his captor's grip, ran down a narrow street shouting in such a loud voice that nobody could understand what language he was talking, and in the twilight they believed he was one of them.
But when he was on the wall, it was obvious that he was addressing the besiegers, to warn them of a trap. It wasn't clear what he was protecting them against, since those outside, if the gate wasn't opened, couldn't come in and therefore were hardly at risk. It made no difference that, precisely because of his stupidity, Diepold had courage and was at the top of the wall waving his sword and challenging all the Alessandrians. They, as the rules of a siege demand, could not admit that an enemy had reached the wall, even if arriving from within. Above all, only a few were in on the plot, and the rest suddenly saw an Alaman in their midst as if nothing had happened. So someone decided to stick a pike into Diepold's back, flinging him down from the bastion. At the sight of his best beloved comrade falling lifeless at the foot of the keep, the Bishop of Speyer lost his head completely and ordered the attack. In a normal situation, the Alessandrians would have behaved as usual, firing on the attackers from the top of the fortifications, but as the enemy pressed to the gates, a rumor was spreading that St. Peter had appeared, to save the city from danger, and he was preparing to lead a victorious sortie. Meanwhile, Trotty had thought to exploit this misunderstanding, and had sent his bogus St. Peter to go out first, drawing all the others after him.
In short, Buandulino's trick, which should have clouded the minds of the assailants, clouded instead those of the assailed. The Alessandrians, gripped by mystic furor and by the most bellicose ecstasy, were flinging themselves like beasts against the Imperials, and in such a disordered way, contrary to the rules of the art of war, that the Bishop of Speyer and his knights, bewildered, fell back, imitated by those who were meant to push the crossbowmen's towers, leaving them at the very edge of the fatal thicket.
For the Alessandrians it was an open invitation, immediately Anselmo. Medico with his Piacentines slipped into the tunnel, which now was truly helpful, and emerged behind the Genoese, with a group of bold men carrying poles on which they had stuck balls of burning pitch. And so the Genoese towers caught fire like kindling.
The crossbowmen jumped off, but as they hit the ground, the Alessandrians were there to strike their heads with clubs. One tower first tilted, then crumbled, spreading flames among the bishop's cavalry. The horses seemed crazed, upsetting the ranks of the Imperials even more, and those not on horseback contributed to the disorder, because they ran through the ranks of the riders shouting that St. Peter in person was arriving, and perhaps also St. Paul, and some had even seen St. Sebastian and St. Tarcissus. The whole Christian Olympus, in other words, had joined that loathsome city.
At night, some men brought to the imperial camp, already in deep mourning, the corpse of the Bishop of Speyer, struck in the back as he was fleeing.
Frederick sent for Buandulino and asked what his part in this story was and what he knew of it, and Buandulino wanted to sink through the ground, because that evening many brave men had died, including Anselmo Medico of Piacenza, and valorous sergeants, and poor foot soldiers, and all for that fine plan of his, which should have resolved everything without a hair of anyone's head being touched.
He threw himself at Frederick's feet, telling him the whole truth, how he had thought to offer him a credible pretext for raising the siege, and instead things had gone as they had. "I'm a wretch, dear father," he said. "Blood revolts me, and I wanted to keep my hands clean, and spare many other deaths, and look at the slaughter I've wrought. All these deaths are on my conscience." "Curse you, or curse those who botched the plan," Frederick replied, apparently more saddened than angered, because, "Don't tell this to anyone. That pretext would have indeed been a help to me. I have had fresh news. The League is on the move, perhaps as soon as tomorrow we'll have to fight on two fronts. Your St. Peter would have convinced the soldiers, but now too many have died, and my barons are demanding revenge. They're going around saying that this is the right moment to teach the people of this city a lesson. It was enough to see those people when they came out, thinner than we are, and they were really making their final effort. By then it was Holy Saturday. The air was tepid, the fields were decked with flowers, and the trees were joyously sprouting.
The people were sad as at a funeral, the Imperials because each said it was time to attack and nobody felt like doing it, the Alessandrians because, after the effort of the last sortie, their spirits were high, though their bellies were hanging between their legs.
Thus it was that Buandulino's fertile mind set to work again. He rode once more towards the walls, and found Trotti, Guasco, and the other leaders grave and frowning. They also knew about the arrival of the League, but they had heard from a reliable source that the various communes were deeply divided as to how to proceed, and very uncertain as to whether they should actually attack Frederick.
Because it's one thing, Master Nikitas. Now mind you, this is a very fine point that maybe Byzantines aren't subtle enough to grasp. It's one thing to defend yourselves when the emperor is besieging you, and another thing to start a battle on your own initiative.
I mean, if your father hits you with his belt, you have the right to try to grab it and tear it from his hands. That's self-defense. But if you're the one who raises his hand to strike your father, then it's patricide. Once you have definitively shown disrespect to the Holy and Roman Emperor, what do you have left to keep the Italian communes together? You understand, Master Nikitas. There they were, having just torn Frederick's troops to pieces, but they continued to recognize him as their sole lord.
They didn't want him underfoot, but it would have been awful if he no longer existed. They would have massacred one another not even knowing if they were acting well or badly, because the criterion of right and wrong was, in the end, the emperor. So, Guasco said, the best thing would be for the emperor to abandon immediately the siege of Alessandria, and I assure you the communes would allow him passage to reach Pavia.
But how could he be permitted to save appearances? We had already tried the sign from heaven, and the Alessandrians had gained a great satisfaction, but they were again back where they started from. St. Peter had been too ambitious, Buandulino then remarked, and a vision or an apparition, whatever you choose to call it, is something that's there and isn't there. Besides, the next day it's easy to deny it. Finally, why trouble the saints? Those mercenaries were people who didn't believe even in the Father Almighty. The only thing they believed in was a full belly and a hard cock. Let's suppose. Gagliardo said then, with the wisdom that God, as all know, gives only to poor folk, let's suppose that the Imperials capture one of our cows, and they find her so stuffed with wheat that her belly's about to explode. Then Barbarossa and his men will think that we still have so much food that we can hold out in Sculascolorum, and so it'll be those very same lords and soldiers who'll say let's clear out, otherwise we'll still be here for next Easter. I've never heard such a stupid idea, Guasco said, and Trotti agreed with him, tapping his brow with one finger, as if to say the old man was by now weak in the head. And if there was still a cow alive, we'd have already eaten her, even raw, Boydie added. Not because this man's my father, but the idea doesn't seem to me something to be disregarded, Buandulino said. Maybe you've forgotten it, but there is one cow left, and it's Gagliardo's very own Rosina. The only problem is whether, even if you scrape every corner of the city, you'll find enough wheat to make the animal burst. The problem is that you're a dumb animal yourself, you animal. Gagliardo leapt to his feet.
Because obviously to understand that she's full of wheat, the Imperials have not only to find her, but also cut her open, and we haven't slaughtered my Rosina because for me and your mother she's like the daughter the Lord never granted us, so nobody's going to touch her. I'd sooner send you to the shambles, after you stay 30 years away from home, while she's stayed here with us, without any bees in her bonnet. Guasco and the others, who until a moment before were thinking this idea worthy of a madman, Once Galeotto opposed, it became instantly convinced that it was the best conceivable plan, and they bent every effort to convince the old man that, when the fate of the city is involved, you sacrifice even your personal cow, and it was useless for him to say he'd rather give up Buandulino, because cutting open Buandulino wouldn't convince anyone, whereas cutting open the cow might make Barbarossa drop everything.
As for the wheat, they didn't have any to squander, but by scratching around, a bit here and a bit there, they should collect enough to fatten Rosina, and without being over fussy, because once it was in the stomach, it was hard for anyone to say if it was wheat or chaff, and without bothering to remove the weevils, or roaches, or whatever you call them, for in wartime you found them even in the bread. Come now, Buandulino, Nikita said, you're not going to tell me that everyone was seriously considering such a piece of nonsense. Not only did we consider it seriously, but, as you'll see subsequently, the emperor took it seriously, too. In fact, this is how the story went.
Towards the third hour of that holy Saturday, all the consuls and the persons of greatest authority in Alessandria were under a shed where a cow was lying, and a more skinny and moribund cow it would be hard to imagine, the hide blotchy, the legs like sticks, the teeth seemed ears, the ears seemed nipples, a stunned gaze, even her horns drooping, and the rest more carcass than body, not so much a cow as the ghost of a cow, a Totentan's cow, lovingly tended by Buandulino's mother, who stroked Rosina's head, saying that after all this may be for the best, her sufferings would end, and after a hearty meal, and hence she was better off than her master and Ms. Towards the third hour of that holy Saturday, all the consuls and the persons of greatest authority in Alessandria were under a shed where a cow was lying, and a more skinny and moribund cow it would be hard to imagine, the hide blotchy, the legs like sticks, the teeth seemed ears, the ears seemed nipples, a stunned gaze, even her horns drooping, and the rest more carcass than body, not so much a cow as the ghost of a cow, a Totentan's cow, lovingly tended by Buandulino's mother, who stroked Rosina's head, saying that after all this may be for the best, her sufferings would end, and after a hearty meal, and hence she was better off than her master and mistress. Drea were under a shed where a cow was lying, and a more skinny and moribund cow it would be hard to imagine, the hide blotchy, the legs like sticks, the teeth seemed ears, the ears seemed nipples, a stunned gaze, even her horns drooping, and the rest more carcass than body, not so much a cow as the ghost of a cow, a Totentan's cow, lovingly tended by Buandulino's mother, who stroked Rosina's head, saying that after all this may be for the best, her sufferings would end, and after a hearty meal, and hence she was better off than her master and mistress. Nearby, sacks of wheat and seeds kept arriving, collected as best anyone could, and Galeotto put the food under the muzzle of the poor creature, urging her to eat.
But the cow now looked upon the world with moaning detachment, and no longer even recalled what ruminating meant. So, finally, some hardy souls held her legs fast, others her head, and still others forced her mouth open, and as she was weakly mooing her refusal, they thrust the wheat down her throat, as is done with geese. Then, perhaps out of an instinct for self-preservation, or stirred by the memory of better days, the animal began moving with her tongue all that plenty, and a bit through her own will and a bit through the help of the bystanders, she started to swallow.
It was not a joyous meal, and more than once it seemed to all that Rosina was about to give up her animal's soul to God, for she ate as if she were giving birth, between one moan and the next.
But then the life force took the upper hand, the cow struggled to her four hoofs and went on eating by herself, sticking her muzzle directly into the sacks that were offered her. In the end, what they were all seeing was a quite odd cow, very skinny and melancholy, with her spine protruding and marked as if the bones wanted to escape the hide imprisoning them, while the belly, on the contrary, was opulent, rotund, hydropsical, and taut as if she were heavy with 10 calves. It won't work, it won't work. Boydie shook his head in the face of this profoundly sad portent. Even a fool can see that this animal isn't fat, she's just a cowhide that's been stuffed. And even if they do believe she's fat, Guasco said, how could they accept the idea that her master still takes her out to pasture, risking the loss of both his life and his precious animal?
My friends, Buandulino said, don't forget that, whoever the men who find her are, they'll be so hungry that they won't stop to see if she's fat here and thin there.
Buandulino was right.
Towards the 9th hour, Galeotto had barely ventured out the gate, to a meadow half a league from the walls, when from the woods came a band of Bohemians, who were surely out hunting for birds, if there was still a bird alive in those parts.
They saw the cow, unable to believe their ravenous eyes, they flung themselves on Galeotto. He promptly held up his hands, and they dragged him and the animal towards the camp.
Soon a crowd had gathered around them, warriors with hollow cheeks and bulging eyes, and poor Rosina's throat was soon slashed by a Como man who seemed to know the art, because he did it with one stroke, and Rosina, in the time it takes to utter an amen, was alive one moment and dead the next.
Galeotto really did cry, and so the scene appeared convincing to all.
When the animal's belly was cut open, what was to happen happened. All that food that had been so hastily forced into her now poured out on the ground as if it were still intact, and to all it seemed indubitable that it was wheat. The amazement was such that it prevailed over appetite, and in any case hunger had not robbed those armed men of an elementary ratiocination. If, in a besieged city, the cows could feast to this degree, it went against every rule, human and divine. A sergeant, among the bystanders, was able to repress his own instincts, and decided that his commanders should be informed of the wonder.
Shortly the news reached the ear of the emperor, with whom Buandulino was lingering, with apparent indolence, while tense and nervously awaiting events. The carcass of Rosina, a canvas sheet in which the overflowing grain had been gathered, and Gagliardo and irons were brought before Frederick. Dead and split in two, the cow no longer seemed fat or thin, and the only thing that could be seen was all that stuff inside and outside her belly. A sign that Frederick did not underestimate, as he immediately asked the peasant, "Who are you? Where are you from? Whose cow is that?"
And Gagliardo, even without understanding a word, replied in the purest dialect, "I don't know, I wasn't there. I have nothing to do with this. I was just passing by chance, and this is the first time I've ever seen this cow, and if you hadn't told me yourself, I wouldn't even have known it's a cow."
Naturally Frederick did not understand, and he turned to Buandulino. "You know this bestial language, tell me what he's saying." Scene between Buandulino and Gagliardo, translation: he says he knows nothing about the cow, that a rich peasant in the city gave her to him to take out to pasture, and that's all. Ask him how that happened. He says that all cows, after they've eaten and before they've digested, are full of what they've eaten. Tell him not to play dumb, or I'll tie his neck to that tree. In this town, in this city of bandits, do they always give wheat to their cows?
Gagliardo: with lack of hay and lack of straw, we feed the stock on wheat. And Arbioni.
Buandulino: he says no, only now when there's a shortage of hay, because of the siege. And anyway, it's not all grain, there are also some dry Arbioni. Arbioni? C. Pisa, peas. By the devil, I'll give him to my falcons to peck it, or my dogs to tear limb from limb. What does he mean by saying there's a shortage of hay but none of wheat and peas?
He says that in the city they've collected all the cows of the area, and now they can eat beefsteaks till the end of the world, but the cows have eaten all the hay, and that people, if they can eat meat don't eat bread, or, even less, dried peas, so a part of the wheat they had stored up they are giving to the cows.
He says it's not like it is here with us, who have everything. There they have to make do the best they can because they are poor citizens under siege.
He says this is why they gave him the cow to take outside, so she could eat a bit of grass, because this stuff by itself is bad for her and she gets ringworm.
Buandulino: do you believe what this clod is saying? I'm only translating what he says. As far as I recall from my infancy, I'm not sure that cows like to eat wheat, but this one was surely full of the stuff, and the evidence of your eyes can't be denied. Frederick stroked his beard, narrowed his eyes, and took a good look at Gagliardo.
Buandulino, he said then, I have the impression that I've seen this man before, only it must have been a long time ago.
You don't know him? Father, I know more or less everybody around here. But the problem now isn't to ask who this man is, but whether it's true that in the city they have all these cows and all this wheat. Because, if you want my sincere opinion, they could be trying to deceive you, by stuffing their last cow with the last of their wheat. Good thinking, Buandulino. That hadn't occurred to me. Most Holy Majesty, the Marquis of Monferrato spoke up, we must not credit these peasants with more intelligence than they possess. It seems to me we have a clear sign that the city is better supplied than we had supposed. Oh, yes, yes, all the other lords said with one voice, and Buandulino concluded that he had never seen so many people of bad faith, altogether, each clearly recognizing the bad faith of the others. But it was a sign that this siege was by now intolerable for all. And so apparently it must seem to me, Frederick said diplomatically. The enemy army is pressing us from behind. Taking Rovereto wouldn't save us from having to face the other army. Nor can we think of conquering the city and shutting ourselves up inside those walls, so ill-made they'd be an insult to our dignity. So, my lords, we have come to this decision. We'll abandon this wretched town to its wretched cowherders, and prepare ourselves for quite different conflict. Have the appropriate orders issued. And then, coming out of the royal tent, he said to Buandulino, send that old man home. He's surely a liar, but if I had to hang all liars, you would have left this world long since. Hurry home, father. You've been lucky, Buandulino whispered, removing Gagliardo's irons, and tell Trotty that I'll be waiting for him this evening at the place he knows. Frederick did it all in haste. There was no need to remove any tents, those tatters that now constituted the besiegers' camp. He lined the men up and ordered everything to be burned. At midnight, the vanguard of the army was already marching towards the fields of Marengo. In the background, at the foot of the Tordona hills, some fires were glowing. In the distance, the army of the League was waiting. Asking leave of the emperor, Buandulino rode off in the direction of Sale, and at a crossroads he found Trotti waiting for him with 2 consuls of Cremona. They rode together for a mile, until they reached an advanced post of the League. There Trotti introduced Buandulino to the 2 leaders of the communal army, Azelino da Romano and Anselmo da Dovara. A brief council followed, sealed by a handshake. Having embraced Trotti, "It's turned out fine, thanks to you." "No, no, thanks to you." Buandulino went back as quickly as possible to Frederick, who was waiting at the edge of a clearing. "It's settled, father. They won't attack. They have neither the desire nor the nerve. We will pass, and they will hail you as their lord." "Until the next fight," Frederick murmured, "but the army's tired. The sooner we're quartered in Pavia, the better. Let's go." It was the early hours of the feast of Easter. In the distance, if he had turned around, Frederick would have seen the walls of Alessandria shining with tall fires. Buandulino turned and saw them. He knew that many flames were those of the war machines in the imperial lodgings, but he preferred to imagine the Alessandrians dancing and singing to celebrate victory and peace. After a mile, they came upon a vanguard of the League. The squad of horsemen separated and formed 2 wings, between which the Imperials passed. It was not clear if this movement was a greeting or if the troops were drawing aside as a precaution. You never can tell. Some of the League men raised their weapons, and this gesture could have been interpreted as a salute. Or perhaps it was a show of impotence, a threat. The emperor, frowning, pretended not to see them. "I don't know," he said. "I feel as if I were retreating, and these men are showing me the honor of arms." "Buandulino, am I doing the right thing?" "Yes, you are, father. You are no more surrendering than they are. They don't want to attack you in the open field out of respect. And you must be grateful for this respect." "It's my due," Barbarossa said stubbornly. "If you think they owe it to you, then be happy that they are giving it to you. What are you complaining about?" "Nothing, nothing. As usual, you are right." Towards dawn they glimpsed in the distant plain and on the first hills the main body of the opposing army. It blended with a light mist, and once again it wasn't clear whether they were moving away from the imperial army out of prudence, or simply gathering around, or if they were pressing closely and menacingly.
In little groups the people of the communes were moving, sometimes accompanying the imperial process for a stretch, sometimes posting themselves on a hillock to watch the army pass. At other times they seemed to flee it.
The silence was profound, broken only by the sound of the horses' hoofs and the tread of the soldiers. From one peak to the next they occasionally glimpsed, in the very pale morning, slender threads of smoke rising, as if one group were sending signals to another, from the top of some tower concealed in the green, up there on the hills. This time Frederick decided to interpret that perilous passage as occurring in his own honor. He had the standards raised in the oriflammes, and he marched past as if he were Caesar Augustus, who had put down the barbarians. However it was, he passed, father of all those unruly cities that could, that night, have annihilated him. By now on the road to Pavia, he called Buandulino to his side. "You're the usual rogue," he said. "But after all I did have to find some excuse to leave that mud puddle. I forgive you." "For what, dear father?" "I know what. But you mustn't think I've forgiven that nameless city. It has a name. It doesn't because I haven't baptized it. Sooner or later I'll have to destroy it. Not immediately. No, not immediately. But before then, I imagine you'll have invented another of your tricks. I should have understood, that night, that I was taking a rascal home with me. By the way, I've remembered where I saw that man with the cow before." But Buandulino's horse seemed to rear up, and Buandulino, pulling on the reins, had been left behind. So Frederick could not tell him what he had remembered. 15. Buandulino at the Battle of Legnano. With the siege over, Frederick, relieved at first, withdrew to Pavia, but he was not content. A bad year followed. His cousin Henry the Lion was giving him trouble in Germany. The Italian cities continued to be unruly and turned a deaf ear every time he demanded the destruction of Alessandria. By now he had few men, reinforcements failed to arrive, and when they did arrive, they were insufficient. Buandulino felt somewhat guilty because of the cow trick. To be sure, He hadn't deceived the emperor, who had simply gone along with his game, but now both of them felt some awkwardness looking each other in the eye, like two children who have devised a prank and are then ashamed of it. Buandulino was touched by the almost childish embarrassment of Frederick, who was now beginning to go gray, and it was, in fact, his handsome copper beard that first lost its leonine glints. Buandulino was more and more fond of that father, who continued to pursue his imperial dream, risking more and more the loss of his lands beyond the Alps, to keep control over an Italy that was eluding him on all sides. One day it occurred to Buandulino that, in Frederick's situation, the letter of Prester John would have allowed the emperor to extract himself from the Lombard swamps without seeming to renounce anything.
In short, the priest's letter was a bit like Galeotto's cow. He then tried to talk to Frederick about it, but the emperor was in a bad mood and told Buandulino he had far more serious things to concern himself with than the senile fancies of Uncle Otto, rest his soul.
Then he gave the youth some other missions, sending him back and forth across the Alps for almost 12 months.
At the end of May of the year of our Lord 1176, Buandulino learned that Frederick was installed in Como, and he decided to join him in that city.
In the course of his journey he was told that the imperial army was now moving towards Pavia, so then he turned southwards, hoping to meet it halfway. He met it along the Olona, not far from the fortress of Legnano, where a few hours earlier the imperial army and the army of the League had met, without any desire on either side to join battle, though both were forced into a conflict to save their honor. As soon as he arrived at the edge of the field, Buandulino saw a foot soldier running towards him with a long pike. He spurred his horse, trying to run the man down, hoping to frighten him. The soldier was frightened and fell on his back, letting go of the pike. Buandulino dismounted and seized the pike, while the man shouted threats to kill him, standing up and drawing a dagger from his belt. But he was shouting in the Lodi dialect.
Buandulino had become accustomed to the idea that the people of Lodi were with the empire, and keeping the soldier at bay with the pike, because he seemed out of his mind. Buandulino shouted, "What are you doing, you fool? I'm with the empire too."
The man shouted back, "I know. That's why I'm going to kill you." At that point Buandulino remembered that Lodi now was on the side of the League, and he asked himself, "What shall I do? Kill him? The pike is longer than his knife. But I've never killed anybody." He jabbed the pike between the man's legs, sending him sprawling full length on the ground, then aimed the weapon at his throat. "Don't kill me, Dominus, because I have 7 children, and if I die they'll die of hunger tomorrow," the Lodi man cried. "Let me go. I can't do your people much harm. You see how I give in like an idiot."
"You're an idiot, all right. Anyone can see that at the distance of a day's march."
"But if I let you go with something in your hand, you could still do some harm." "Take off your breeches." "My breeches?" "That's right. I'll spare your life, but I'm making you go around with your balls in the air. I want to see if you go back to fighting like that, or if you run straight home to your lousy children." The enemy took off his breeches and began to run through the fields, leaping over the hedges, not so much from shame, but because he was afraid an enemy knight could see him from behind and, thinking he was displaying his buttocks in contempt, impale him, Turkish style. Buandulino was content that he had not had to kill anyone, but now a man on horseback was galloping towards him. The rider wore French dress, so was obviously not a Lombard. Buandulino decided to sell his life dearly and he drew his sword.
The rider passed by him, shouting, "What are you doing, you lunatic? Can't you see that today we screwed you Imperials?
Go home, that's best for you." And off he rode, not seeking any trouble. Buandulino remounted and asked himself where he should go, because he understood absolutely nothing of this battle, and until now he had seen only sieges, in which case you clearly know who is on this side and who on the other.
He rode around a clump of trees, and in the midst of the plain saw something he had never seen before. A great open wagon, painted red and white, with a long pennon and banners at its center, and an altar surrounded by some soldiers with long trumpets like the ones angels hold, which perhaps served to urge the men into battle, whereupon he said, as they said around his part of the country, "Hey, that's enough."
For a moment he thought he had happened upon Prester John, or was in Sarandib at the very least, where they went into battle on a wagon drawn by elephants, but the wagon he now saw was drawn by oxen, even if all decked out like gentlemen, and around the wagon there was no fighting. The men with trumpets let out a blast every so often, then stopped, unsure what to do next. Some of them pointed to a tangle of people on the shore of the river, who were still flinging themselves on one another, letting out cries to wake the dead. Others were trying to make the oxen move, but restive as they generally are, they now seemed even more reluctant to get mixed up in the brawling. "What shall I do?"
Buandulino wondered.
Shall I jump into the midst of those fanatics down there, not even knowing who the enemies are, unless they speak first? And maybe, while I'm waiting for them to speak, they'll kill me? As he was pondering the question, another knight came towards him, and this was a ministerial whom he knew well. The man also recognized him and shouted, "Buandulino! We've lost the emperor." "What do you mean you've lost him, for Christ's sake?" "Somebody saw him fighting like a lion in the midst of a horde of foot soldiers, pushing his horse towards that little wood. Then they all disappeared among the trees. We went over there but couldn't find anybody left. He must have tried to escape in some direction, but he surely didn't return to the main body of our cavalry." "Where is the main body of our cavalry?" "Actually, the problem isn't only that he didn't rejoin the main body of the cavalry, it's that the main body of the cavalry no longer exists. There was a slaughter, curse this day. In the beginning Frederick and his horsemen hurled themselves on the enemy, who seemed all on foot, all gathered around that catafalque.
But those foot soldiers fought back, and suddenly the Lombard cavalry turned up, so our men were attacked on two sides."
"You mean to say you've lost the Holy Roman Emperor? And you tell me in this tone? God help us. You look like you just got here. You don't know what we've been through." Some say they actually saw the emperor fall, and then he was dragged off by the horse, his foot caught in the stirrup. "What are our men doing now?"
"They're running away."
"Look there. They're scattering among the trees, throwing themselves into the river. Now there's a rumor that the emperor's dead, and each man is trying to get to Pavia as best he can. The cowards. And nobody's looking for our Lord anymore? Darkness is falling. Even the men who had kept on fighting are about to stop. How could you find anyone here, or God knows where? Cowards." Buandulino said again. Though he was not a man of war, he had a great heart. He spurred his horse and, with sword drawn, flung himself upon a great pile of corpses, as he called in a loud voice for his beloved adoptive father. Seeking a dead man on that plain, among so many other corpses, and shouting to him to give a sign, was a desperate enterprise, so much so that the last Lombard squads he encountered let him pass, taking him for some saint from paradise who had come to lend them a hand, and greeting him with festive gestures. Where the fighting had been most bloody, Buandulino began turning over the bodies that lay face down, still hoping and at the same time fearing to discover in the dim twilight the beloved features of his sovereign.
He wept, and proceeded so blindly that, emerging from a grove, he bumped into that great ox-drawn wagon, which was slowly leaving the battlefield.
"Have you seen the emperor?" he shouted, in tears, without reason or restraint.
The men started laughing, and one said to him, "Yes.
"He was in those bushes over there, screwing your sister," and one blew clumsily into his trumpet to produce an obscene blast. They had spoken idly, but Buandulino went to look in those bushes. There was a little pile of corpses, 3 prone on top of the 4th, supine. He lifted the 3, and underneath he saw a red beard, but red with blood. Frederick. He realized at once that he was alive, because a kind of faint rattle came from his parted lips.
There was a wound on his upper lip, which was still bleeding, and a broad dent on his brow stretching to the left eye. Both hands were still clenched, a dagger in each, like one who, on the verge of losing consciousness, had still been able to stab the 3 wretches who had attacked him. Buandulino raised his father's head, cleansed his face, called him. Frederick opened his eyes and asked where he was.
Buandulino touched him, to see if he had any other wounds. Frederick cried out when his foot was touched. Perhaps it was true that his horse had dragged him, dislocating his ankle. Still talking to him, while he asked again where he was, Buandulino helped him sit up.
Frederick recognized Buandulino and embraced him.
"My lord and father," Buandulino said, "now you will mount my horse, but you mustn't strain yourself. We must proceed cautiously, even if night has fallen, because all around us are the troops of the League, and our only hope is that they're in some village carousing, since, no offense, it seems they've won. But some could still be nearby looking for their dead. We'll have to go through woods and ditches, staying off the roads, to reach Pavia, where your troops have withdrawn. You can sleep on the horse. I'll take care you don't fall off." "And who'll take care that you don't fall asleep while you're walking?" asked Frederick, with a taut smile. Then he said, "It hurts when I laugh." "I see you're well, now," Buandulino said. They proceeded through the night, stumbling in the dark, even the horse, over roots and low bushes. Only once did they see, in the distance, some fires, and they went out of their way to avoid them. As they advanced, to keep himself awake, Buandulino talked, and Frederick remained awake to keep him awake. "This is the end," Frederick said. "I will never bear the shame of this defeat. It was only a skirmish, father. Anyway, they all believe you are dead. You'll reappear like Lazarus resurrected, and what was considered a defeat will be considered a miracle by everyone, and they'll sing a Te Deum." In truth, Buandulino was only trying to console a wounded and humiliated old soldier. That day the prestige of the empire had been compromised, Rex et sacerdos or not. Unless Frederick were to return on stage in a halo of new glory. And at this point Buandulino couldn't help recalling Otto's hopes for the letter of the priest. "The fact is, dear father," he said, "that from what has happened you should finally learn one thing." "And what would you like to teach me, Master Wise Man?" "You don't have to learn from me, God forbid, but from heaven. You must consider carefully what Bishop Otto used to say.
In this Italy, the farther you go, the more you get stuck in the mud. You can't be emperor where there is also a pope. With these cities you will always lose, because you want to impose order, which is a work of artifice, whereas they, on the contrary, want to live in disorder, which is in accord with nature, or, rather, as the Parisian philosophers would say, is the condition of the yle, the primogenial chaos. You must turn east, beyond Byzantium, impose the banners of your empire in the Christian lands that extend beyond the kingdoms of the infidels, joining the one, true Rex et sacerdos, who has ruled there since the time of the Magi. Only when you have sealed an alliance with him, or he has sworn submission to you, can you return to Rome and treat the Pope like your scullion, and the kings of England and France like your stableboys. Only then will your victors of today again be afraid of you. Frederick hardly remembered the prophecies of Otto, and Buandulino had to remind him of them. "That priest again?" Frederick said. "Does he really exist? And where is he? And how can I move a whole army to go and look for him? I would become Frederick the Foolish, and so I would be remembered through the centuries. No, not if in all the chancelleries of all the Christian kingdoms, Byzantium included, there was a letter in circulation that this Prester John has written to you alone, recognizing you as his only equal, and inviting you to join your two kingdoms." And Buandulino, who knew it almost by heart, began reciting in the darkness the letter of Prester John, also explaining what was the most precious relic in the world, which the priest was sending him in a coffer. "But where is this letter? Do you have a copy of it? Are you sure you didn't write it yourself?" "I recomposed it in good Latin. I joined a membra disiecta of things that the wise already knew and said, though nobody listened to them. But everything in that letter is true as gospel. We might say, if you like, that my hand simply placed the address on it, as if the letter were sent to you. And this priest could give me what did you call it, the grazel in which the blood of our Lord was collected? To be sure, that would be the ultimate, perfect unction." Frederick murmured. So that night, along with the fate of Buandulino, the fate of his emperor was also decided, even if neither of the two had yet grasped where they were heading. As both still daydreamed of a distant realm, towards dawn, near a ditch, they found a horse that had fled the battle and was unable to find his way. With 2 horses, even though they took 1,000 minor roads, the ride to Pavia went much faster. Along the way they encountered bands of retreating Imperials, who recognized their lord and emitted shouts of joy. Since they had plundered the villages they passed through, they had sustenance, and rushed off to inform others who were farther ahead. So 2 days later Frederick arrived at the gates of Pavia preceded by the joyous news, to find the leaders of the city and his allies awaiting him with great pomp, still unable to believe their eyes. There was also Beatrice, dressed in mourning, because by then they had told her that her husband was dead. She was holding her 2 children by the hand, little Frederick, who was already 12 but looked half that, frail as he had been since birth, and Henry, who on the contrary had inherited all his father's strength, but on this day was weeping in bewilderment, constantly asking what had happened. Beatrice discerned Frederick in the distance, and moved towards him, sobbing, and embraced him with passion. When he told her he was alive thanks to Buandulino, she noticed that the young man was also there, and she went deep red, then quite pale, then she wept, and finally extended her hand to touch his heart and begged heaven to reward the merit of what he had done, calling him son, friend, brother. At that precise moment, Master Nikitas, Buandulino said, I realized that, by saving the life of my lord, I had paid my debt. But for this very reason I was no longer free to love Beatrice. And thus I realized that I loved her no more. It was like a healed wound. The sight of her aroused welcome memories but no yearning. I felt that I could remain at her side without suffering, or leave her without feeling sorrow. Perhaps I had finally become a man, and all youthful ardor was spent.
I felt no displeasure, only a slight melancholy. I felt like a dove that had billed and cooed without restraint, but now the season of love was over. It was time to move, to go beyond the sea. You were no longer a dove, you'd become a swallow. Or a crane. 16. Buandulino is deceived by Zosimos. On Saturday morning Pevera and Grillo came to announce that order was somehow returning in Constantinople. Not so much because the pilgrims' thirst for looting was sated, but because their leaders had realized that the looters had also seized many venerable relics. A chalice or a damask vestment might be winked at, but the relics should not be dispersed. So the Doge Dandolo had ordered that all the precious objects so far stolen should be brought to St. Sophia for fair distribution. Which meant primarily division between pilgrims and Venetians, as the latter were still awaiting payment for having brought the others here on their vessels.
Then they would proceed, calculating the value of every piece in silver marks, and the knights would have 4 parts, the cavalry sergeants 2, and the infantry sergeants 1.
It was easy to imagine the reaction of the soldiery, who were not allowed to seize anything. There were murmurs that Dandolo's men had already taken the 4 gilded bronze horses from the hippodrome to send them to Venice, and everyone was in a bad humor.
Dandolo's only reply was to order the search of troops of every rank, and a further search of their quarters in Pera.
One knight of the Count of St. Pol had been found with a phial upon his person.
He said it was a medicine, now dried up, but when they shook it, the warmth of their hands produced the flow of a red liquid, which was obviously the blood that had flowed from the ribs of our Lord.
The knight cried that he had honestly bought that relic from a monk before the sack, but to set an example, he was hanged on the spot, with his shield and its coat of arms around his neck. Shit. He looked like a codfish, Grillo said. Sadly, Nikitas listened to the news, but Buandulino, immediately embarrassed, as if he were guilty, changed the subject and promptly asked if the time had come to leave the city. The confusion is still great, Pevera said, and you have to be careful. Where did you want to go, Master Nikitas? To Selymbria, where we have trusted friends who can take us in.
Selymbria. Not easy, Pevera said.
It's to the west, near the long walls. Even if we had mules, it's 3 days on the road, and maybe more, and with a pregnant woman.
And imagine, too, crossing the city with a fine stable of mules, you look like someone important, and the pilgrims will fall on you like flies.
So the mules had to be prepared outside the city, and their party had to cross the city on foot.
They would have to pass the walls of Constantine and then avoid the coast, where surely there were more people, skirt the church of St. Mosius, and leave by the Paget gate in the walls of Theodosius.
It's not likely to go so well that nobody will stop you, Pevera said. Ah, Grillo commented, to get it in the ass is a moment's work, and all these women will make the pilgrims foam at the mouth. It still took a full day, since the young women had to be prepared. The leper scene couldn't be repeated because by now the pilgrims had realized that lepers didn't roam about inside the city. Some dots, some scabs had to be made on their faces, so they would appear to have scabies, enough to make them unattractive. Then all this group, for 3 days, would have to eat, because, as the saying goes, an empty sack won't stand up. The Genoese would prepare some baskets with an entire pan of scripolata, their bread made of chickpea flour, thin and crusty, which they would cut into strips, wrapped in broad leaves. With a little pepper on top it would be delicious enough to nourish a lion, and broad slices of flat cake. With oil, sage, cheese, and onions.
These barbarian dishes didn't appeal to Nikitas, but, since they would have to wait another day, he decided he would devote it to savoring the final delicacies that Theophilus could still prepare and listen to the final adventures of Buandulino, because he didn't want to leave just as the story was reaching its peak, and not knowing how it ended.
My story is still too long, Buandulino said. In any case, I will go with you. Here in Constantinople I've nothing more to do, and every corner stirs nasty memories. You have become my parchment, Master Nikitas, on which I write many things that I had forgotten, as if my hand proceeded on its own. I think that one who tells stories must always have another to whom he tells them, and only thus can he tell them to himself. You remember when I wrote letters to the Empress, but she didn't see them? If I committed the foolishness of letting my friends read them, it was because otherwise my letters would have had no meaning. And later, there was that moment of the kiss with the Empress. I could never tell anyone of that kiss, and I carried the memory of it inside me for years and years, sometimes savoring it as if it were your honeyed wine, and sometimes tasting a toxin in my mouth. It was only when I could tell it to you that I felt free. And why could you tell it to me? Because, now, when I tell you, all those who were connected with my story are no more. Only I remain. Now you are as necessary to me as the air I breathe. I will come with you to Selembria. As soon as he had recovered from the wounds suffered at Legnano, Frederick called for Buandulino, along with the imperial chancellor, Christian of Book. If the letter of Prester John was to be taken seriously, it was best to begin at once. Christian read the parchment that Buandulino showed him, and, clever chancellor that he was, he voiced some objections. The writing, to begin with, did not seem to him worthy of a chancellery.
That letter was to circulate among the papal court, the courts of France and England, reach the basileus of Byzantium, and therefore it had to be formed as important documents are prepared throughout the Christian world.
Then, he said, it would take time to make seals that really looked like seals. If a serious job was to be done, it had to be done scrupulously. How was the letter to be purveyed to the other chancelleries? If it was sent by the chancellery of the empire, it would not be credible. What? Prester John writes you privately to enable you to find him in a land unknown to all, and you let it be known Lippes et tonsoribus, so that someone else could arrive there before you?
Rumors concerning the letter should certainly spread, not only to legitimize a future expedition, but above all to astound the whole Christian world. But all this had to happen a little bit at a time, as if a profound secret were being divulged.
Buandulino suggested using his friends. They would be agents above suspicion, scholars of the studium of Paris and not Frederick's men. Abdul could contraband the letter in the kingdoms of the Holy Land, Boron in England, Kayat in France, and Rabbi Solomon could see it reach the Jews living in the Byzantine Empire. So the following months were spent on these various tasks, and Buandulino found himself directing a scriptorium where all his old companions were at work. Frederick from time to time asked for news. He had ventured the suggestion that the offer of the Grazel be a bit more explicit. Buandulino explained the reasons why it was best left vague, but he realized that this symbol of royal and priestly power had fascinated the emperor. As they were debating these matters, Frederick was again beset with new trials.
He now had to resign himself to seeking an agreement with Pope Alexander III. Seeing that the rest of the world did not take very seriously the imperial antipopes, the emperor would agree to pay Alexander homage and acknowledge him as the sole and genuine Roman pontiff. And this was a big step. But in return the Pope had to make up his mind to withdraw all support of the Lombard communes, and this was even bigger.
Was it worthwhile? Both Frederick and Christian asked themselves at this point, while extremely cautious plots were being woven, to provoke the Pope with a renewed call for the union of sacerdotium and imperium. These delays made Buandulino champ at the bit, but he could not protest. Indeed, Frederick removed him from his plans, sending him on a very delicate mission to Venice in April of 1177. It was a matter of organizing with great care the various details of the meeting that, in July, would take place between Pope and Emperor. The reconciliation ceremony should be arranged in every detail and no untoward incident should disturb it. Christian was particularly afraid that your basileus might want to provoke some disturbance, to make the meeting fail. You must know that for some time Manuel Comnenus had been plotting with the Pope, and certainly that agreement between Alexander and Frederick would foil his plans. It scotched them forever.
For 10 years Manuel had been proposing to the Pope the reunification of the two churches. He would recognize the religious primacy of the Pope and the Pope would recognize the Basileus of Byzantium as the sole, authentic Roman emperor, of both East and West.
But with such a pact Alexander did not gain much power in Constantinople and he wouldn't get Frederick out of his way in Italy and would perhaps alarm the other European sovereigns. So he was choosing the alliance most advantageous for himself. But your Basileus sent spies to Venice. They passed themselves off as monks. Probably they were monks. In our empire the men of the church work for their Basileus and not against him. But as far as I can understand, and remember, at that time I was not yet at court, they did not send anyone to stir up trouble. Manuel was resigned to the inevitable. Perhaps he wanted only to be informed about what was happening. Master Nikitas, surely you know, since you were logothete of countless secrets, that when spies from opposing sides meet on the same field of intrigue, the most natural thing is for them to maintain relations of cordial friendship, each confiding his own secrets to the others. Thus they run no risk of stealing them from one another, and they look very clever to those who have sent them. And so it happened between us and those monks. We immediately told one another why we were there, we to spy on them, and they to spy on us, and afterwards we spent some delightful days together. These are things an astute statesman foresees, but what else should he do? If he questioned the foreign spies directly, and, for that matter, he doesn't know them, they would tell him nothing. So he sends his own spies, with secrets of scant importance to reveal, and comes to know the things he should know, which usually are known already to everyone save himself, Nikitas said. Among these monks there was a certain Zosimos of Chalcedon. I was struck by his haggard face, a pair of eyes like carbuncles constantly rolling, illuminating a great black beard, and by his very long hair. When he spoke, he seemed to be talking with a crucified man, bleeding 2 palms' length from his face. I know the type. Our monasteries are full of them. They die very young, of consumption. Not him. In my whole life I have never seen such a glutton. One evening I even took him to the house of 2 Venetian courtesans, who, as you probably know, are specially famous among the practitioners of that art as old as the world. By 3 in the morning I was drunk and I left, but he stayed on and, some time later, one of the girls told me she had never had to deal with such a demon. I know the type. Our monasteries are full of them. They die very young, of consumption. Buandulino and Zosimos had become, if not friends, companions in debauchery.
Their association began when, after a first and generous drinking bout together, Zosimos uttered a horrible blasphemy and said that he would have given, that night, all the victims of the massacre of the innocents for a maid of indulgent morality.
Asked if that was what was taught in the monasteries of Byzantium, Zosimos replied, as Saint Basil taught, there are 2 demons that can trouble the intellect, that of fornication and that of blasphemy.
But the second operates briefly and the first, if it does not agitate our thought with passion, does not prevent the contemplation of God. They went immediately to demonstrate obedience, without passion, to the demon of fornication, and Buandulino realized that Zosimos had, for every situation in life, a maxim from some theologian or hermit that made him feel at peace with himself.
On another occasion they were again drinking together, and Zosimos was singing the praises of Constantinople. Buandulino was embarrassed, because he could tell him only about the back streets of Paris, full of the excrement people flung from the windows, or about the sullen waters of the Tanaro, which could hardly compare with the gilded sea of the Propontis. Nor could he tell him of the Mirabilia Urbis Mediolani, because Frederick had ordered all of them destroyed. He didn't know how to silence his companion. So, to amaze him, he showed him the letter of Prester John, as if to say that somewhere there was an empire that made Zosimos's look like a barren heath. Zosimos had barely read the first line when he asked, suspiciously, Presbyter Johannes? Who is he? You don't know? Happy is he who has attained that ignorance beyond which it is not licit to proceed. You may proceed. Read on.
He read on, with eyes that became more and more fiery, then he put down the parchment and said, in a detached tone, Ah yes, Prester John.
In my monastery I read many accounts by those who had visited his kingdom. But before reading this, you didn't even know who he was. The cranes form letters in their flight without knowing the art of writing. This letter tells of a priest named John and it lies, but it speaks of a real kingdom, which in the accounts I have read is that of the Lord of the Indias.
Buandulino was ready to bet that this rogue was guessing, but Zosimos didn't give him time to doubt sufficiently.
The Lord asks 3 things of the man who is baptized: true faith of his soul, sincerity of his tongue, and continence of his body. This letter of yours cannot have been written by the Lord of the Indias because it contains too many errors. For example, it names many extraordinary creatures of those parts, but says nothing of, let me think, nothing, for example, of the Methagallinary, of the Thinzyrte, and of the Comethyderne. And what are they? What are they? Why, the first thing that happens to anyone who arrives in the region of Prester John is that he encounters a Thinzyrete, and if he isn't prepared to confront it, scrunch, he's devoured in one mouthful. Those are places when you can't just go as if you were going to Jerusalem, where at most you find a camel or 2, a crocodile, a pair of elephants, and such. Furthermore, the letter seems suspicious to me because it's very odd it should be addressed to your emperor rather than to our basileus, since the kingdom of this John is closer to the empire of Byzantium than to that of the Latins. You speak as if you knew where it is. I don't know exactly where it is, but I know how to go there, because he who knows the destination knows also the way to it. Then why have none of your Rami ever gone? Who told you no one ever tried to go there? I could say that if the Basileus Manuel ventured into the lands of the Sultan of Iconium, it was precisely to open the way towards the realm of the Lord of the Indias. You could say it, but you haven't. Because our glorious army was defeated in those very lands, at Myriocephalum, 2 years ago. And now, before our Basileus can mount a new expedition, it will take some time.
But if I had great funds at my disposal, and a band of well-armed men capable of facing 1,000 difficulties, with an idea of which direction to take, I would have only to set out.
Then, along the way, you inquire, you follow the advice of the natives. There would be many signs, and once you were on the right road you would begin to see trees that flourish only in those lands and to come upon animals that live only down there, like the methagallinary, in fact. 3 cheers for the methagallinary, Buandulino said, raising his glass. Zosimos invited him to join in a toast to the kingdom of Prester John. Then he challenged him to drink the health of Manuel, and Buandulino agreed provided Zosimos drank the health of Frederick. Then they drank to the Pope, to Venice, to the 2 courtesans they had met a few evenings before, and in the end Buandulino collapsed first, asleep, with his head on the table, while he could still hear Zosimos' laborious muttering. This is the monk's life. Never act with curiosity, never walk with the unjust, never snatch with your hands. The next morning Buandulino said, his tongue still thick, Zosimos, you're a rascal. You haven't the slightest idea where your Lord of the Indias is. You want to set out on instinct, and when somebody tells you he saw a methagallinarius over there, you go off in that direction and in no time you come to a palace all of precious stones, you see some character and you say good morning, Father John, how are you? You can tell this sort of thing to your basileus, not to me. But I happen to have a good map, Zosimos said, opening his eyes. Buandulino objected that, even with a good map, everything would still remain vague and hard to decide, because everyone knows that maps are not precise, especially for places where, at most, Alexander the Great has been, and no one else after him. And he made a rough sketch of the map drawn by Abdul. Zosimos burst out laughing. Of course, if Buandulino followed the most perverse and heretical idea that the earth is a sphere, he couldn't even begin the journey.
Either you trust the Holy Scriptures, or else you're a pagan who still thinks the way they thought before Alexander, who, for that matter, was incapable of leaving us any map.
The scriptures say that not only the earth but the whole universe is made in the form of a tabernacle, or, rather, that Moses built his tabernacle as a faithful copy of the universe, from the earth to the firmament. But the ancient philosophers, not yet enlightened by the word of the Lord, invented the Antipodes, while in the Acts of the Apostles it says that God from one man devised our humankind to inhabit the entire face of the earth, its face, not the other side, which doesn't exist. And Luke's Gospel says that the Lord gave the apostles the power to walk on serpents and scorpions, and to walk means to walk above something, not below. Anyway, if the earth were a sphere and suspended in the vacuum, it would have neither an above nor a below, and so there would be no sense, no direction in the walking. Who thought the heavens were a sphere? The Chaldean sinners from the top of the Tower of Babel, insofar as they were able to erect it, misled by the feeling of terror that the looming sky inspired in them. What Pythagoras or what Aristotle has been able to announce the resurrection of the dead? And would ignoramuses of that stripe have understood the shape of the world?
Would this world shaped like a sphere have served to predict the rising or setting of the sun, or the day on which Easter falls, whereas most humble people, who have studied neither philosophy nor astronomy, know very well when the sun sets and when it rises, according to the seasons, and in different countries they calculate Easter in the same way, without deceiving themselves.
Is it necessary to know a geometry other than the one a good carpenter knows, or an astronomy different from what a peasant observes when he sows and when he reaps? And besides, what ancient philosophers are you talking to me about? Do you Latins know Xenophanes of Colophon, who, while asserting that the world was infinite, denied that it was spherical? The ignoramus can say that, considering the universe like a tabernacle, you can't explain eclipses or equinoxes. Well, in the empire of us Romans, centuries ago there lived a great sage, Cosmas Indicopleustes, who traveled to the very confines of the world, and in his Christian topography demonstrated in irrefutable fashion that the earth truly is in the form of a tabernacle, and that only thus can we explain the most obscure phenomena. Could you say that the most Christian of kings, John, I mean, would not follow the